was one of the pivotal events of the Reagan years. A Korean passenger airliner shot down by a Soviet fighter jet.
In 1983, the Soviets shot down a passenger plane, killing 269 people on board.
Why did the Soviets fire on a defenseless airliner?
The Soviets truly believed that this was a spy plane.
How did Flight 007 get off course?
Clearly, something distracted them at the crucial moment.
And where was it shot down?
The military provided tracking data which unambiguously showed the aircraft out past the 12-mile limit.
Why wasn't it warned before the attack?
It was miles, hundreds, thousands of miles out of the range of any Western radar.
We used 21st century forensic technology to reinvestigate this controversial event.
The wreckage was found by the divers here, which is approximately 20 nautical miles from Sakhalin Island.
And we hear a first-person account of what actually happened from the pilot who shot down the plane. As we recreate the final flight of KAL 007.
The airplane begins to pitch up, tries to oppose it,
And seek to unravel the tragic events of that night on Unsolved History.
Korean Air 007, turn left heading 220.
At the Flight Training Academy in Miami, Florida, a team of investigators is recreating one of the most controversial events of the Cold War. Using the B-747-200 flight simulator, they hope to discover what really happened to Flight KAL 007. September 1st, 1983. Korean Airlines Flight 007 with 269 people aboard is shot down in Soviet airspace. There are no survivors. 23 casualties are children under the age of 12. The incident ignites an explosion of outrage around the world. The United States claims that the Soviets had fired upon a defenseless civilian aircraft without provocation.
There was absolutely no justification, either legal or moral, for what the Soviets did.
The Soviet Union counters that the wide-body 747 was actually a spy plane, and that their actions were justified.
The Soviet regime, to the end of its days, insisted the mission had been a spy flight. They hid away the data, the recorders that they had discovered, and their own internal reports on the behavior of their air defense forces.
How did the Korean airliner get so far off course? Could the Soviets have mistaken the huge passenger plane for a much smaller military aircraft? Did they give the civilian airplane adequate warning? Was KAL 007 indeed in Soviet airspace when it was shot down? And why was so little wreckage found? To help answer these questions, Unsolved History has assembled a team of investigators and experts. Historian in residence Daniel Martinez. Retired aviation investigator Ron Schleed. Space shuttle engineer Jim Oberg. Retired 747 pilot Hal Ewing. Russian aviation investigator Vladimir Kaufman. Former Russian Air Force General Anatoly Kornikov. And Russian journalist Andrei Ilyich. Plus, we'll hear in his own words a moment-by-moment account of the tragedy by the man who actually shot down KAL 007, Russian fighter pilot Lieutenant Colonel Gennady Osipovich. To understand the complex factors behind the downing of KAL 007, we must first set the scene. In 1983, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were near an all-time high. President Ronald Reagan had declared the Soviet Union the evil empire, and the two great superpowers were engaged in a dangerous game of brinksmanship. On September 1st, the game turned deadly. 1 a.m. After stopping to refuel in Anchorage, Alaska, Korean Airlines Flight 007 departs on the second leg of its flight from New York to Seoul, Korea. The shortest route to Seoul would have taken the jet over Soviet territory. But due to the tension between the Soviet Union and the U.S., commercial aircraft routinely flew just outside the border of the vast USSR. 10 minutes after departing Anchorage, KAL 007 starts drifting off course. 80 minutes later, the plane is no longer in contact with Alaska's air traffic control and is following an entirely new path. It is heading straight for the Soviet military base on Kamchatka Peninsula. KAL 007 is now out of range of any of the North Pacific radio beacons. The plane misses its first checkpoint, designated Bethel.
After it passed Bethel, which it missed by only 12 miles, not really enough to give the radar controllers, even had they been watching, much of a heads up, there are no more beacons on the entire North Pacific route until you get to Japan.
Kamchatka Peninsula is home to several important Soviet military installations. As KAL 007 approaches Kamchatka, the Soviet Air Defense orders fighter jets to intercept the errant plane. 32 minutes later, however, Flight 007 crosses Kamchatka and re-enters international airspace. Soviet Air Defense tracks the airliner as it continues on a southwest heading. KAL 007's cockpit crew continues to make weather and location reports to air traffic controllers in both Anchorage and Tokyo, apparently unaware that they have strayed into Soviet airspace.
The passengers on that airplane, even the crew, in all probability, weren't even aware that they had ever violated Soviet airspace.
Soon, 007 approaches Sakhalin Island. Within minutes, the airliner will again be in Soviet airspace. The Soviet Defense Command orders MiG-23 and Su-15 interceptors into the air. For 20 minutes, the fighters shadow 007.
The Soviets had launched aircraft out to meet the intruder, came around behind it, and followed it across the island.
At 3:15 a.m. local time, the jumbo jet pilot requests permission to climb to 35,000 feet. 3 minutes later, Su-15 pilot Lieutenant Colonel Gennady Osipovich receives orders to destroy the aircraft. Osipovich fires his two missiles, each bearing 70 pounds of high explosives, and reports to ground control that the target is destroyed. It takes 12 minutes for the fatally damaged airplane to spiral 35,000 feet down. KAL 007 crashes into the Sea of Okhotsk, just north of Monoran Island, 350 nautical miles off course. Why did the plane fly so far off its route? How could a highly skilled crew who had flown the same flight hundreds of times not realize that they were following a different flight path on September 1st?
How could they fly like this? How could an experienced pilot really ignore his navigation? This remains a mystery.
Lawyer Juanita Madola represented the family members of the victims of KAL 007.
The claim was negligence on the part of the cockpit crew, that they had devices in the cockpit that would have let them know that they were off course in terms of coordinates, and also that they were over land when they should have been over water. So our argument was that they were totally oblivious to where they were and didn't care, or they knew that they were off course but were trying to fumble their way across the Pacific anyway.
Discover precise planning.
They were well organized, well armed. They had this ideological strength that made them more influential.
Absolute chaos.
the shards of glass from the front of the building coming through and slicing through my head and through my body.
Discover supernatural thrills.
We know that evil exists in the world.
Paranormal chills.
I could sense that someone was there.
Get out of my house! Do you hear me? Get out of my house!
Discover the will to survive.
And I can feel the power of the river. I cannot breathe. I feel I'm dying.
The ultimate sacrifice.
Deep down, we both knew that it was the only thing we could really do.
Discover the human limit. Being a top model isn't all glitz and glamour. Sure, there are the photo shoots, the parties, the girls, and the pampering. But there's also the pain, the extreme makeovers, the hours at the gym. Not to mention the critics, the paparazzi, and the greasy fanboys. It's not all fun and games, but on some days, it's all worth it. New episodes of Rides, tomorrow night on Discovery Channel. This February on Discovery Channel. The most important space shuttle mission in NASA history. Space Shuttle Countdown to Combat. The stories of the men behind the largest architectural projects of our time. Kings of construction. Survivors relive their death-defying experiences in I Shouldn't Be Alive. February on Discovery Channel. Passion. Love. Anger. Conflict. Great works of art are born of these. Discovery Channel continues that great tradition. American Chopper, new episodes, tomorrow night on Discovery Channel.
Why did Korean Airlines Flight 007 fly off course that fateful night in 1983? How could an experienced flight crew fail to notice that they were straying into Soviet airspace? To answer these questions, we are about to recreate the final flight of KAL 007. At the Flight Training Academy in Miami, Florida, Unsolved History's historian-in-residence Daniel Martinez joins retired 747 pilot Hal Ewing in a state-of-the-art flight simulator. Hal has studied the crash of KAL 007 for over 20 years. By combining data from the 1993 report by the International Civil Aviation Organization and the black box recordings, Ewing can reproduce the airspeed, altitude, and coordinates of KAL 007 from the time it took off until it was shot down.
So what exactly happened that night? What went wrong with this navigation?
We're going to simulate the takeoff and initial climb and make the same turns that they made at the same time that they made. The simulator here has been set to the same weight, the same center of gravity, the same weather conditions, the trim is the same. To the maximum of our ability, everything is the same as it was that night.
Okay.
Like all airliners at that time, KAL 007 depended upon an inertial navigation system, or INS, which guided the plane by a series of ground-based radio beacons.
The route the aircraft was supposed to fly was R20, which is an airway. And R20 has certain waypoints along the way that are entered in to the inertial navigation system. And the inertial navigation system, when it's linked to the autopilot, will then fly the aircraft to each of these waypoints to keep it on its proper track.
But using this system isn't automatic. The pilot needs to manually switch the aircraft to the INS mode so that the plane heads for the correct destination.
When it reached a certain location, the autopilot should have been linked to the inertial navigation system, which had waypoints entered in it that would have taken the aircraft on a route that would have kept it out of Soviet airspace.
But on September 1st, 1983, the INS was not engaged.
For some reason, the switch was in all probability never moved from heading to INS. to actually engage the INS system. Clearly, something distracted them at the crucial moment, caused them to simply forget to move the switch from heading to INS, and then they never caught the error for the remaining 5 hours of the flight. One of the central questions that the general public has had about this incident since it happened is, how could someone not have seen what was going on? Why didn't ground control see that the flight was off course? Why didn't somebody warn KL 007 that it was about to stray into the Soviet Union? The answer is right here. These are all the sites that existed in 1983 that could have seen Korean Air 007 on radar as it headed off to the west toward Seoul. It began to deviate from its desired track almost immediately after takeoff. A direct track from where it was at that moment to Bethel is not depicted on the chart, and it's not depicted on the radar scope of the controller. So there was really no way for the controller to know whether the flight was proceeding at any given moment direct to Bethel or not, simply by looking at his radar scope.
Now, we have radars that, even at that time, that could reach out thousands of miles in space and track an object. Why couldn't that track KAL?
The problem is they're usually large, very powerful phased array radars, and they're designed to look at space. They're not designed to look at things close to the surface of the Earth. So, because of their antenna position and because of the fact that the Earth is round, KL 007 was simply underneath their radar horizon almost all the time. Now, as you can see from the chart here, when KL 007 started getting seriously off course and beginning to penetrate Soviet airspace way over here,
it's out of the radar.
He was miles, hundreds, thousands of miles out of the range of any Western radar. The Russians had radar and the Russians saw them, but they used their radar for another purpose. But there's no evidence, and never has been, to suggest that any civil radar, that any air traffic controller would have been looking at on that night had the capability to warn KAL 007 that it was proceeding off course.
With KAL 007 out of radar range, a series of coincidences converged to create a tragedy. There were several other planes in the immediate area that night. Another Korean Airlines flight was en route. In addition, 75 miles away, an RC-135, an American spy plane, was monitoring secret Soviet missile tests. The RC-135 is a converted Boeing 707, which has a similar configuration to a 747, but it is much smaller. These military spy planes would fly figure eights in and out of Soviet airspace, listening to Soviet communications and collecting data.
The Soviets knew all about these kinds of missions because they were routine, they've been flown many times, and Soviet pilots had scrambled to actually chase down and often wave to some of these aircraft.
Every airline had been warned that to intrude over Soviet territory could result in a possible attack.
The whole area was militarized, so to have an airliner coming across this area, even by accident, set them up for this disaster.
The stakes were raised even higher by the risky game of cat and mouse being played between the USSR and the United States.
It was common practice in those days for the U.S. To use RC-135s to tease the Soviets, mocking that they were going to penetrate their territory. They would fly toward their territory, and the Soviets would bring up their radars and send up fighters, and then the RC-135s would turn around.
As 007 neared Soviet airspace, its flight path began to converge with that of the RC-135.
The Soviets were watching the aircraft on their radar, and different radar controllers in different locations were reporting position points to a central area, and someone in that central command was plotting these positions on a map. Someone made an error in reporting these coordinates or reporting the numbers, and when they plotted it, they showed that the two aircraft had in fact moved into the same area, in fact had merged and then separated.
Did the Soviets confuse the two planes and target the wrong aircraft? How could anyone familiar with aviation mistake a Boeing 747 for another aircraft?
There are numerous superficial similarities in that they're both large, swept-wing, four-engine, low-wing jet transports. Both airplanes were just unpainted natural aluminum on the bottom of the wings and the bottom of the fuselage, so the coloration would be similar.
If the Soviet fighter planes had approached the suspicious aircraft from behind and below, they would have seen an outline matching a 707. And a 707 converted into an RC-135 was what they were expecting to find. In order to clearly identify the plane, the fighter pilot would have to approach it from the side, where he would have seen the distinctive hump of the 747.
Do we have any indication that the Russian fighter pilot did that?
In the case of the shoot-down, he transmitted back to his controllers several interesting pieces of information, but nothing that lets us know for sure that he had identified it as an airliner or a 747.
Retired Army General Anatoly Kornikov was the chief commander of air defense for Sakhalin Island.
We discovered an unidentified plane heading towards Sakhalin. Radars were activated and interceptor pilots ready in their cockpits. Soon we could identify the plane. It was still far away. I immediately decided to launch interceptors on duty into the air.
Lieutenant Colonel Gennady Osipovich was one of the fighter pilots sent to intercept the intruder.
I took off, they gave me the course immediately northeast, because the plane was coming from the north, from Kamchatka. At first I didn't expect it to be a military flight, but then they told me to activate my weapons and aim them at this target.
General Kornikov claims every effort was made to identify the errant aircraft.
We were making sure that the flashing navigation lights were on. The pilot said yes. The flashing lights are working.
A flashing light indicates that a plane is carrying civilian passengers, but this made little difference to the Soviet general.
Judging by the shadow and configuration, he said it looked like an RC-135. I reported that I was ready to fire. No, they said, wait, don't shoot, don't fire your missiles. Approach his altitude and force the plane to land. In other words, they really didn't want to destroy it. I approached its altitude about 10,200 meters with readiness, and I started to flash my warning lights. This is a well-known international signal. You are in violation. I did it again, but again he didn't answer. I reported that he wasn't reacting. They told me, fire warning shots from your cannons. I moved even closer to it and shot first in a direction like this, parallel to its flight path. I fired about 4 rounds of warning shots and turned a little and fired another shot. And again, there was absolutely no reaction and no transmission from it.
The Soviets had to make a decision. The Boeing 747 was nearing Sakhalin Island, home to 6 military airfields and the gateway for the Soviet fleet to the Pacific Ocean.
The plane was already approaching the island west coast. When I reported that the plane is absolutely not reacting and it's flying over our base, they gave me the order to destroy the plane.
For KAL 007, time was running out.
In an age of constant change, one series keeps pace.
This is not your average car.
Putting you one step ahead.
I see you have visitors. Hello to you all.
Hello. Beyond Tomorrow unveils breakthrough technologies that are driving the waves of the future.
The aircraft is a true double-deck aircraft.
And helping to preserve what could be lost forever. See what lies straight ahead on Beyond Tomorrow. Tomorrow night on Discovery Channel. In a brand new crime series, we arrive at a scene, crawling with police, looking for clues, while the media films the evening's gruesome news. And onlookers gaze in horror, shocked that this could ever happen in their neighborhood.
There was blood everywhere.
Graphic first-person accounts from different points of view that write the missing chapters of crime stories. Saturday nights on Discovery Channel.
We're ready, crew.
What's better, a Ferrari or a Porsche?
What's your smile on my face?
A Ducati or a Y2K?
Why would you put a jet engine in a motorcycle? Because we can.
A Spitfire or a Mustang?
Ferociously fast.
Will you agree with our panel of experts?
Awesome. Legend. #1.
As they have the final word on the greatest machines ever built. The greatest ever. Tonight on Discovery Channel.
This is a land of extremes and contrasts. A home to a diversity of wildlife, where the most unique and weirdest animals and plants live in some of the toughest but most beautiful landscapes imaginable. Wild Australasia premieres Wednesday, February 8 on Discovery Channel. Being a top model isn't all glitz and glamour. Sure, there are the photo shoots, the parties, the girls, and the pampering. But there's also the pain, the extreme makeovers, the hours at the gym. Not to mention the critics, the paparazzi, and the greasy fanboys. It's not all fun and games, but on some days, it's all worth it. New episodes of Rides, tomorrow night on Discovery Channel.
For Korean Airlines Flight 007, its fate was sealed once it crossed over Soviet airspace. But exactly what transpired in those last few crucial moments? Unsolved history is about to reconstruct the final minutes of 007. The Su-15 pilot who fired the deadly shots will give us a step-by-step account of the actual event.
Initiating our turn, 220.
And in our flight simulator, pilot Hal Ewing will attempt to control the wounded 747 once it has been struck by the missile. As the Soviet fighter closed in on Kal 007, the airliner made an unexpected move. It began to climb from 33,000 feet to 35,000 feet. To the Soviet Su-15 pilot, the jet appeared to be taking evasive action.
Right at that moment, something changed. No time for reasoned analysis about why that change might have happened. It's just noticing that, oh no, it's not maintaining a stable flight path.
He's seen me and he's pulling a trick.
Osipovich finally got into position and fired 2 missiles. One, a heat-seeking rocket. The other, a radar-guided missile.
The left rocket is heat-seeking through infrared, and the right rocket is radar-guided. I didn't see the impact of the heat-seeking one, but the radar-guided I saw. Because you shoot it, and then you have to aim it by sighting it with beam, so it does not go off and self-destruct. I saw it explode right under the tail, near the stabilizer. I reported that the target was destroyed and returned to my airbase.
According to the cockpit voice recorder, this is the first indication that anything is wrong.
That's on the voice recorder. Someone says, what's that? The airplane begins to pitch up.
Nose down. Okay, you're nosing back over.
You should be losing the hydraulics about now.
Decompression.
The rocket has destroyed the hydraulic controls, the plane's nervous system. From the flight recorder, we know that the engines were still operating normally.
The only change is this point here where the pilot himself reduced power in an effort to control this climb. We also have a verbal comment that was recorded by the cockpit voice recorder in which the flight engineer or the second officer advised the captain after the missile strike that all 4 engines were normal.
Looking back here, we can imagine what they couldn't see or never knew. The tail is scrap metal. An extra drag in the tail is jerking the tail back, pulling the nose up. Meantime, with all the scrap back there and the damage, the hydraulic lines going through the tail are all now bleeding. We're about to lose all 4 of our hydraulic systems.
All the hydraulic fluid would be lost, and if that happens, the airplane's pretty much uncontrolled.
A minute later, the cockpit recording stops.
I don't think that the concept of an attack would have ever occurred to him. I don't think they lived long enough to really think it through and even grasp the idea that they might have been hit by a missile.
Another 10 minutes will pass before the passenger jet strikes the water at over 700 miles per hour. Korean Airlines 007 is totally destroyed. All 269 people on board are killed. Osipovich claims he fired several warning shots at the jetliner. But did the fighter pilot know that he was tracking a passenger plane?
First of all, I didn't have time to figure out what kind of plane it was. I was the only one in the cockpit, and a plane is not a car. For one person to navigate, to aim weapons, to observe everything, and at the same time figure out if it is a civilian plane or whether it is waving at me friendly. I had only one goal. I was basically aiming, how to say, to kill. This is what I learned.
Osipovich was following orders as he was trained to do. But did he follow the correct international procedures?
The international accepted procedure is for the fighters to come up alongside, make visual contact with the crew to alert them by either flashing their lights or firing cannons. The fighters that were sent up to intercept Korean Air did not follow the international procedures for interception and identification.
Following is the actual audio recording of the radio conversation between Osipovich and his commanding officer in the minutes leading up to the moment he fired his missiles.
I flashed warning lights, meaning you are trespassing. I shot 4 rounds, more than 250 shells from cannons. We have more than 500. I didn't see the shells. They had to see the flashes from the barrel. They're big at night. Everyone could see it. We used all possible means to let them know they were trespassing. Commands from the ground, from the air, by blinking lights, by warning shots from the cannons.
But why didn't KAL 007 see the warning shots from the Su-15? The answer lies in another deadly coincidence. Just as Osipovich fired his warning shots, 007 started elevating to 35,000 feet. The warning shots passed beneath the 747, out of the pilot's line of sight.
How could it be that such an experienced and well-prepared crew and its captain, who had repeatedly flown the president of his country on this very route, could have gotten lost?
According to the Soviets, the tragic decision to destroy the civilian airliner was simply a case of mistaken identity. But one troubling question remains. Precisely where was the plane shot down?
Was the Korean airliner shot down in Soviet airspace or just seconds outside the Russian border?
Was it struck, as the Soviets claimed, in their airspace? Or is it possible that the Soviet fighter plane shot it down after it left Russian territory?
This is a detailed map of the search areas. Where was the plane found?
Right here, X marks the spot where the wreckage was located. It's interesting to note that if you trace the 12-mile limit around Monaran Island and the 12-mile limit off the west coast of Sakhalin, it is definitely in international waters.
The first investigation by ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, was inconclusive. 2 crucial pieces of evidence were missing: the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, the so-called black boxes.
The cockpit voice recorder does just what the name implies. It records all the sounds and all the voices that occur on the flight deck so that investigators can listen in and hear what's going on.
In 1992, 2 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, finally allowed access to KAL's black boxes.
The flight data recorder was missing for almost 10 years. Finally turned over to ICAO in 1992, when we were able to see these traces right here and all the rest of the data on the flight data recorder. Finally, for the first time, we could have a much better idea of exactly what happened aboard Korean Air 007 that night.
In order to confirm where KAL crashed, Unsolved History utilized a state-of-the-art search and rescue program called SARMAP. Working backwards, software designer Owen Howlett and oceanographer Malcolm Spaulding were able to calculate where the jumbo jet actually hit the water by using information about the debris found after the crash. Both tides and currents cause items in the water to move in predictable ways.
We have some indication about where the debris was found and roughly the time period that it occurred. And so let's say that the debris was being picked up along the shore in the southeast area of Akito Island in Japan. And so what we're looking for is actually where that path intersects with the flight path. Where we see these particles now intersect with the green line, which is K007's flight path, we would say that's probably the origin or the location of where the wreck site could be found.
After tracking the water patterns back to the crash site, Howlett and Spaulding confirmed their results by following the debris forward again.
Now that we have information about the actual wreck site, we've essentially overlaid where the wreck was found by the green airplane symbol. It says wreck found, and we've overlaid on that as well the location of where we thought the search area should have been located for the debris field that we saw. See that the location of the wreck is to the south and west slightly of where the missile attack occurred, which seems consistent with the flight path and subsequent airplane motion after the attack occurred.
The wreckage was found by the divers here, which is approximately 38 kilometers, or that's about 20 nautical miles from Sakhalin Island.
Then that indicates that the wreckage was located just outside the 12-mile limit of territorial waters of the Soviet Union.
That's right, Ron. It looks like it was about 14 nautical miles offshore.
This confirms where the plane actually hit the water. But precisely where did the Soviet jet fire on the airliner? Did the deadly missile strike the jumbo jet when it was in neutral territory? Russian aviation investigators Vladimir Kofman and Yuri Chigurov were part of the original International Civil Aviation Organization team in 1983.
Presented here are the results of the decoding of the black box recording from plane Kal 007. The decoding was conducted in 1983. Because we did not have proper equipment, the decoding was done manually.
Based on data from Soviet radar, Kal 007 did not plunge straight down after being struck by the missile. Instead, it went into a long, wide spiral.
Here, on this graph, we see the plane's movements after it was hit. Here is the downward spiral with loss of altitude and speed. With the spiral descent, the plane's fuselage skin started disintegrating. The debris was dispersed over the 5 to 7 kilometer radius.
Adding to the mystery surrounding Kal 007 was the relative lack of debris found at the crash site. This led to accusations by the Soviets that Kal 007 was indeed a spy plane. To this day, General Kornikov is skeptical that 007 was a civilian aircraft.
I'm still convinced there were no passengers on that plane, and I have grounds to think so.
There were countercharges that the reason there were no bodies was that the Soviets had captured the passengers and were holding them as prisoners. So where were the remains? Submarine Captain Mikhail Gears piloted one of the submersibles involved in the recovery.
We were actually looking for the Boeing, or what was left of it, and our main task was to recover the black boxes.
Once the Soviets found the black boxes, they needed to determine if there had been any passengers aboard the alleged spy plane. Only the parts of 4 human bodies, including 1 child, were ever recovered.
We found bones and body parts. You've seen my pictures. There were many underwater creatures that immediately eat everything, including crabs, and there was a strong current there. For a month, at a depth of over 200 meters, They were trying to fetch human remains from underneath a heap of plane debris. The remains were taken to the seashore, and doctors tried putting body parts together to determine how many people there were.
Identifying the bodies was impossible. In fact, authorities were unable even to prove that the dismal remains were from KAL 007.
There were very few remains from the crash of Korean Airlines 007, and we now know that the Soviet ships had actually found the wreckage, and they did not either salvage the cargo or find ways to give back to the families anything of the possessions or the bodies of the passengers. There is speculation that any remains that were either recovered from the wreckage or that washed on shore were destroyed by the Soviets because they did not want evidence of what they had discovered.
So where were the bodies? How could they have disappeared so quickly? Some experts believe the aircraft was totally destroyed upon hitting the water. Very little remained of the plane and its passengers.
If the wreckage is seriously torn apart and just in small pieces, we'd have to assume that it had a lot of airspeed and a lot of impact when it hit the water. Conversely, if the fuselage and other parts of the airplane are largely intact, then you'd have to assume a lesser impact, but still enough to kill everybody on the airplane.
KAL 007 would have disintegrated upon crashing into the ocean, the same way as if it had impacted upon the ground. Still, many relatives of the victims believed that because there were so few remains, that there must have been survivors.
There are still some family members who would like to believe that their loved one is alive, even if they're being held hostage in prison in Siberia. The fact that there were very few personal effects that were found means that there is no closure for the family members. They had no memorabilia of their loved one that they could bury and have a place to go grieve over.
In 1993, Russian journalist Andrei Ilyich organized a second dive to the crash site to search for clues. He invited Mikhail Gears to help with the investigation.
The main question still engendering myths is why no corpses were found. The task was to raise numbered parts of the plane and dissipate the ridiculous theories that this was the wrong plane and the Russians were hiding something. I retrieved the numbered parts so that we could send them to Boeing in Seattle and prove that they belonged to that specific plane.
Ilyich personally retrieved several items from the sea bottom which he believes proves that there were no survivors, that KAL 007 was utterly destroyed on impact.
This is inflatable life jacket. You can see that it belonged to Korean Airlines. The passenger apparently didn't have time to put it on. It all happened very fast. We brought this up from the bottom during our expedition. It was held down by big metal parts, otherwise it would have floated up and been carried away by the current.
But what about the human remains? We now know that the crash debris was quickly dispersed over the ocean floor by swift currents, scavengers, and time. But we still do not have the answer to the most difficult question of all. Where was KAL 007 actually shot down? Was it still inside the sensitive Soviet zone? Or had the 747 already passed into neutral and supposedly safe airspace?
This is a land of extremes and contrasts. A home to a diversity of wildlife, where the most unique and weirdest animals and plants live in some of the toughest but most beautiful landscapes imaginable. Wild Australasia premieres Wednesday, February 8 on Discovery Channel.
We're ready, crew.
What's better, a Ferrari or a Porsche?
Put some smile on that face.
A Ducati or a Y2K?
Why would you put a jet engine in a motorcycle? Because we can.
A Spitfire or a Mustang?
Ferociously fast.
Will you agree with our panel of experts?
awesome. Legend, number one.
As they have the final word on the greatest machines ever built. The greatest ever, tonight on Discovery Channel.
In an age of constant change, one series keeps pace,
This is not your average car.
putting you one step ahead.
I see you have visitors. Hello to you all.
Hello. Beyond Tomorrow unveils breakthrough technologies that are driving the waves of the future
The aircraft is a true double-deck aircraft.
and helping to preserve what could be lost forever. See what lies straight ahead on Beyond Tomorrow. Tomorrow night on Discovery Channel. Being a top model isn't all glitz and glamour. Sure, there are the photo shoots, the parties, the girls, and the pampering. There's also the pain, the extreme makeovers, the hours at the gym. Not to mention the critics, the paparazzi, and the greasy fanboys. It's not all fun and games, but on some days, it's all worth it. New episodes of Rides. Tomorrow night on Discovery Channel. Passion. Love. Anger. Conflict. Great works of art are born of these. Discovery Channel continues that great tradition. American Chopper, new episodes, tomorrow night on Discovery Channel.
On September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 carrying 269 passengers was shot down over the Sea of Japan by a Soviet plane. For 10 years, the tragedy was kept shrouded in mystery. But in 1992, the Russian Federation relinquished the plane's so-called black boxes to Korean authorities. The 1993 official International Civil Aviation Organization investigation concluded that the Soviet Defense Forces had exercised proper conduct and made every attempt to identify the passenger plane before firing on it. The report also concluded that the Russians had fired on the 747 while it was still in Soviet airspace. But detective work by Jim Oberg, an expert on Soviet disasters, discovered that this was not true. Oberg noticed that on page 10 of the 1993 report, the exact coordinates were listed, including the time, how far off course the plane had flown, and where it was struck by the missile. According to the ICAO report, the target was hit at 3:25 a.m. At that time, KAL 007 was 350 nautical miles to the right of airway R20. The coordinates of the point where the airplane was hit are 46 degrees north and 141 degrees east.
The most precise data was from the Russian tracking data itself, and in a supplement to the report in '93, the Russian government and the military provided tracking data which unambiguously showed the aircraft out past the 12-mile limit.
Are you telling me that Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down outside of Soviet airspace?
By a few miles, not by much, but clearly past it in international waters when the missile was launched. It had already crossed the 12-mile limit back into international waters where it was destroyed.
The coordinates our experts are using come from the Russians themselves.
The reconstruction of the trajectory using the black box data and computer modeling still gave a little uncertainty of a few miles. But it's the Russian data from their own radar sites and numeric values of the position that they gave in 1992 that, when plotted on a map, show where it was attacked.
Exactly what happened during the last flight of Korean Airlines 007 will always remain under a cloud of controversy. Today, the official finding of the International Civil Aviation Organization remains that KAL 007 flew off course due to the Korean pilot's mistake, and that the Soviets believed the jetliner was a spy plane.
The order to destroy was made in absolute conviction and was executed on this basis that this was a spy plane, which intruded very deeply, about 500 miles into the territory of a sovereign state.
But other experts find this impossible to believe.
It's at night, it was running with lights, it was maintaining a straight and level course. The transponder, which the Russians would have been able to read with their radar, was operating, the rotating beacons were operating, and this is just not consistent with an RC-135.
Most likely, the truth lies somewhere in between. Kal 007's brief flight ended because of a series of errors, not just one.
The Soviets truly believed that this was a spy plane right up until ordering the shoot-down. They certainly would not have ordered the shoot-down of a civil aircraft if they knew it was.
To understand how these decisions were made, you must imagine the rampant paranoia. The pilot said it could be a civilian plane. Any serviceman should have understood. His job was not to analyze, but to report what he saw. No one's hands are clean in this story. No one is wearing a spotless shirt. Everybody used this tragedy for their own gain. There's no justice in this story, nor decent side. Everybody, the American side, the Korean side, and the Russian sides, all are somewhat guilty.
Is drinking alcohol good for you? In the Dark Ages, waterborne diseases were rampant, so people drank alcohol instead. This is because alcohol kills bacteria by denaturing their proteins and dissolving their lipids. However, alcohol also dissolves social inhibitions and New Year's resolutions.
We're ready, crew.
What's better, a Ferrari or a Porsche?
That's a smile on my face.
A Ducati or a Y2K?
Why would you put a jet engine in a motorcycle? Because we can.
A Spitfire or a Mustang?
Ferociously fast.
Will you agree with our panel of experts?
Awesome. Legend. Number one.
As they have the final word on the greatest machines ever built. The greatest ever. Tonight on Discovery Channel.
This is a land of extremes and contrasts. A home to a diversity of wildlife, where the most unique and weirdest animals and plants live in some of the toughest but most beautiful landscapes imaginable. Wild Australasia premieres Wednesday, February 8 on Discovery Channel. Discover precise planning.
They were well organized, well armed. They had this ideological strength that made them more influential.
Absolute chaos.
The shards of glass from the front of the building coming through and slicing through my head and through my body.
Discover supernatural thrills.
We know that evil exists in the world.
Paranormal chills.
I could sense that someone was there.
Get out of my house! Do you hear me? Get out of my house!
Discover the will to survive.
And I can feel the power of the river. I cannot breathe. I feel I'm dying.
The ultimate sacrifice.
Deep down, we both knew that it was the only thing we could really do.
Discover the human limit. Beyond Tomorrow unveils breakthrough technologies that are driving the waves of the future and helping to preserve what could be lost forever. See what lies straight ahead on Beyond Tomorrow. Tomorrow night on Discovery Channel.
The majestic Castle Leslie rests near the border between southern and northern Ireland. It has been the home of the Leslie family for over 300 years. In 1996, some unusual activity rattled the nerves of the castle's current inhabitants. Appliances mysteriously turned on without having been plugged in. Bells rang by themselves. Shadowy figures passed through rooms. Guests sleeping in what's called the Red Room experienced something even more terrifying. On 3 separate occasions, 3 different couples were suddenly awakened by the figure of a young man searching through a chest of drawers. They noticed the figure had a wound on his forehead. Who was this ghost, and why was he appearing in Castle Leslie? Recent history may provide an answer. In 1914, Norman Leslie was living at the castle with his mother, Lady Leonie. When World War I began, Norman, in his mid-20s, volunteered to fight with the Rifle Brigade in France. His mother reluctantly bade her beloved son farewell. The exact whereabouts of his regiment were secret, but Lady Leonie wrote many letters as she awaited his safe return. Months later, an employee of the castle spotted Norman standing at the far side of the castle's lake. Overjoyed, he and another worker sent word to Norman's mother. Norman's room was prepared, and the castle was readied for the young soldier's return. But hours passed, and Norman didn't come. He never came. A week later, a telegram arrived. Norman had been killed in action. The date of his death was October 18th, 1914, the very day he'd been seen standing by the castle lake. His appearance is a form of apparition often seen in times of crisis. It's one of the most widely reported kinds of ghost sightings. The image often appears in a place to which in life the person was especially attached. Norman's descendants living in the castle today believe his sudden death and his devotion to family and home prompted his ghostly return to the castle and to the Red Room, which was Norman's bedroom. By all accounts, Norman was a brave soldier and a devoted son. His living relatives continue to welcome his ghostly return to the home and the family he left behind.
This February on Animal Planet. The line that splits the world and the ecosystems that thrive within the warm, humid surroundings. Equator. On the trail of a young orca, an intimate portrait 4 years in the making. Killer whales up close and personal. Led by a former undercover agent, these men take up arms to protect the hunted. This world, tiger traffic. As India's big cats face extinction, tiger expert Valmik Thapar fights to rewrite their future. Tiger Zero. A top 20 countdown of wacky pet gadgets and their equally mad cat creators. Amazing animal inventions. All this February on Animal Planet.
Hi, I'm Minnie Driver. It's alarming how many wonderful animals are being pushed towards extinction by illegal wildlife trade. Take Chiru. This is an antelope found high in the mountains of Tibet. This shy and beautiful creature